on the rise of the West and how that influenced capitalism and free trade. So a little bit about capitalism. It's defined by private ownership and investment in capital. Basically what happens is people come together as a corporation so they can amass more capital to invest and create wealth. So this kind of produces wealth. And it usually separates labor and ownership because the people who are working are not necessarily the ones who are investing in making wealth. Free markets are technically the interactions of privately owned businesses that lack government interference, in theory. And it functions by supply and demand, so it's desired, is produced, and it's supposed to exchange the wealth produced by capitalism.
The rise of capitalism first kind of began in the late 1700s in Europe, partially because of that breakdown of social structure that we were talking about. In the rise of the West, how people began to stand on their own 2 feet and began to work without the interference of the government. And then it spread to the rest of the world, partially by that monkey see, monkey do theory that was talked about a lot in the post-American world. Sort of how for Reed Zachariah made the argument that when the rest of the world saw how the West had been successful with their use of capitalism, they began to adapt to sort of more, I guess, Western type ideas.
So here are some of the effects of capitalism in free markets. One of the first things capitalism did was break down the whole system of mobility of wealth. So it created kind of a distribution of wealth in the beginning. What happened, say, in Europe was that outsourcing brought wealth to peasants, but later what happened was it became, like the people who controlled capital and had the industries became so powerful that it led to big business, which eventually led to government interference. But initially that's what it did. And it kind of unified everybody under a specific economic system because what happened was everybody wanted to compete in the system because it was the only way, it's the most effective way to amass capital and invest. So this is something that Wallerstein talks about, he's a historian, and he says it created core states, peripheral states, and semi-peripheral states. And he says that the core states are like England or Germany that like had the resources and they invested. They're the ones that like invested, they controlled the industry. The peripheral states are the ones that contributed the resources, and semi-peripheral states are the kind of in-between states that still have to compete in the system. Again, it's about resources, so it led to industrialization, which gave advantage to nations such as Britain that had resources, so they could create more profit off of their industries. And then also led to slavery and compensation for labor and cheap products. It also led to the expulsion of minorities. This is something that Wallerstein talks about. He says that since technically economic power was not in the hands of the government tried to kind of shape who would get the influence so they could kind of indirectly have some economic power. So they might expel the minorities that they thought were detrimental to the kind of complete control of resources and industrialization and markets, which is called vertical integration. It also led to commodification. Basically what happened was the best way to make money was to sell commodities. So it kind of led to loss of economic opportunities for a lot of people, because like say in medieval Europe, you might have an artisan that was like favored by the king who could sell their products, but now that would never happen.
Some more of the effects that kind of have to do more with the effects on the people individually rather than like the economic system as a whole. First was the creation of more desire, because capitalism is all about selling your commodity to other people, because commodification was a big deal. So that led to kind of like advertising, so like press ads and that type of thing. And if people see that tobacco is making lots of money or it's being successful and it's being advertised, kind of the point of advertising is that people are going to desire it and want it. So an argument was made that kind of led to like the rise of desire and also to the rise of like the use of things such as tobacco and alcohol. thing. Another thing that changed was family life, because whereas when everyone just kind of farmed for their own needs, having children was beneficial to a family financially, because it helped. They could go and they could, labor in the fields, and they could bring in food for the family and help for them to be successful. But when capitalism rose, everything became about commodities, and family wasn't seen as a commodity. It was just seen as extra mouths to feed and more people to distract from commodification and that sort of thing. So it led to more smaller families. The next thing was kind of the loss of formality, because with the whole globalization thing, there was so much, importing and exporting done that instead of, say, getting your cotton textiles from, your neighbor who you know very well and everything, you're getting it from some random, stranger corporation in, say, India or somewhere like that. So there was the loss of formality. And the last big point was kind of that it led to the motivation to work or to kind of complain. Because with capitalism, there was a lot of that distribution of wealth, like where the leaders of privately owned corporations were getting, or the bosses, or however you want to put it, were getting a lot of the wealth, whereas, the laborers, their labor wasn't equaling the same amount of wealth. So whereas before, if you're picking cotton, you get the money for that cotton. Now you don't get that directly. You just get, a flat wage. So people see that other people are being successful as owning these privately owned businesses, and it either does one of two things. Either gives them the motivation to work and to aspire to be one of those types of people, or it causes them to complain. And I think we're kind of seeing that these days with the whole Occupy Wall Street, Occupy Worcester thing. People didn't like the fact that the wealth was unevenly distributed, that everyone wasn't getting the same amount as before. And then it also led to expansion of industry, because without the interference of the government, it was kind of like the whole Galileo thing that we talked about. People were free to innovate and to come up with their own ideas free of government control. So it led to expansion of ideas, expansion of commodities, and therefore expansion of industry. And so our summary is the semi-global shift to capitalism was driven by the success of capitalism in the late 1700s in Europe. The main effects of the capitalism were the globalization and expansion of the economy and the distribution of wealth not only throughout a nation but throughout the world as a whole. Other effects of the rise of these free markets and global capitalism include industrialization, commodification, expulsion of minorities, slavery, colonization, increased motivation to work or complain, desire, and smaller, more secluded families. And there's